Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar FSMA Final Rule on the Pre-Harvest Use of Agricultural Water. My name is Natalia Tello. I am the Research Manager for the National Mango Board and I will be facilitating this webinar. Let me now introduce our guest speaker for today, who is Dr. Sergio Nieto-Montenegro. Dr. Montenegro earned his PhD in food science from Penn State University. He is the leader of a food and nutrition group based in Chihuahua and El Paso, Texas, where they specialize in converting scientific and technological information into the language of food producers and processors through training programs. The group has developed programs for the American Mushroom Institute, the National Mango Board, Arizona and California LMGA, the citrus, apple, papaya, and avocado industries, the International Fresh Produce Association, among others. The company has more than 50 training apps in the App Store, and the company's programs have been implemented in over 18 different countries. Since 2013, Food Safety CTS has developed the safety and social responsibility programs for the National Mango Board and its members. Now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sergio Nieto-Montenegro so that he can start his presentation. Thank you so much, Natalia. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here to be joined by our mango industry colleagues. So what are we going to talk today? We will be talking about the implementation of the final rule of FSMA about agricultural water use, and I will try to translate the legal language into the language that we speak in our industry. Let me start by give you a reminder on the FSMA, which is the Agricultural Fresh Produce Safety Rule from 2015. And it includes about 7 or 8 rules. And there is one specific rule called Standards for Growing, Harvesting, Packing, and Holding of Human Consumption Fresh Produce, which is also known as the Produce Safety Rule. This is a rule that applies to businesses that carry out activities under the orchard classification. They are covered under this classification, and in addition, they grow and they harvest a product that's subject to the requirements of the rule. In this case, it would be our mango farms, which would be covered by the rule, the Fresh Produce Safety Rule. Now, there are several exemptions, but in general terms, I will first describe the different standards, which are divided in several subparts. For instance, general provisions, general requirements, training, health and hygiene, improvement of biological soil, growing, harvesting, holding, and packing, how to get a qualified exemption, etc. So every rule has subparts. This is very similar to the good practices in agriculture. There is one section, which is subpart E, about agricultural water. This section refers to the agricultural water that is used in pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest activities. As I was telling you, a lot of this information is very similar to the agricultural good practices, which are regulations, requirements that are compulsory if you're going to market mangoes in the US, with the exception for those businesses that can qualify for exemptions. Today, we will be focusing on subpart E, which is agricultural water within the Safety Fresh Produce Rule. First of all, we need to define what agricultural water is. Agricultural water is water that is used in activities that are covered by the rule, where water is or could potentially be in contact with produce or with food contact surfaces during the following activities: pre-harvesting, and also during harvesting and post-harvesting activities. We need to explain this in very simple terms. Agricultural water covered by the rule is the water that will be in contact with the harvested part of the crop or with food contact surfaces. This is a very important concept for all of us to understand. And I would like to ask you to participate in the chat. Let me suggest an exercise. Let's imagine that I have a mango farm somewhere in Latin America, and I'm using water from a canal, and I pump it to my farm, right? And in my farm, which is a mango farm, right? In my farm, I use drip irrigation. And I would like to ask all of the participants through the chat. In this case, is this considered agricultural water? Yes or no? And please give me some life signs in the chat. Some participants say yes, some participants say no. It's tight. Agricultural water is water that is in contact with the harvested part of the crop or with contact food surfaces. If I have a farm where I grow mangoes and I use water from the river, I pump it to my farm and I use dripping irrigation, this water is never in contact with my produce. So is this agricultural water? Yes or no under the rule? That's correct, Benny. Yes, correct. It is not agricultural water. Now, if I use water from a well, I use my water from a well and then I flood my orchard. Do I have agricultural water? Yes or no? The answer is no, as Sonido dos Santos was saying. That's correct. The answer is no. Why? Because the water is not in touch of the harvested part. It's not either in contact with our food contact surfaces. Okay, now I'm going to give you another exercise. Let's imagine that I use water from a well. I am using the water that I extract from my well. And then I use the water to wash my hands, or for the people who harvest the produce so that they can wash their hands. Would this be considered agricultural water? Yes or no? Yes, correct. Why? Well, because hands are considered a food contact surface. The difference would be that one would be considered pre-harvesting water and the other one would be considered harvesting and post-harvesting water. If I use that water from that same well to wash containers, to wash baskets, is this considered agricultural water? Yes. Now, let's go back to what we were saying first. Let's go back. Let's imagine that I'm using water from a well and then I save it in a reservoir and then I use a very big tank where I will be doing foliar applications. Would this be considered agricultural water? Yes or no? Perfect. Yes. Now we're all on the same page on the chat. This is great. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Jose. Why is it so important to mention that? Because if you are not dealing with any agricultural water, this part of the rule will not be applicable to you. In some cases, there are orchards that will be using agricultural water only during harvesting and post-harvesting activities. These are orchards that don't put anything on their orchards and that the water is not in contact with mangoes. Other farms will use agricultural water during pre-harvesting activities where they can have applications. Or sometimes I've seen farms that they use spraying systems and this water is in contact with the produce. Now, let's keep moving on with the presentation. So we have water that can be used during pre-harvesting, which is used during growing, and it can be during the applications of irrigation, fertilizations, or foliar spraying. And it could be also water that is cleaning the trails so that the dust is not accumulating on the mango. This would be also agricultural water. Then we have agricultural water used in harvesting and post-harvesting, which could be used for rinsing or washing of produce movement, for instance, tanks and canals, for produce cooling, for the applications of fungicide during packing, and also in the farms, it can be used for hand washing as well as for cleaning and disinfection. Is everybody following me? How many of you deal with agricultural water? I think that most of you, right? A large majority, probably. Now, today, during our webinar, we will be focusing on pre-harvesting agricultural water and the changes that occurred in the rule. Last year, the new requirements were published, or rather the modified requirements for subpart E, and next month we will soon see the compliance date come into effect. Now, let's imagine that we have a farm in agriculture, and we will find animals, right? Because animals are an integral part of the ecosystems in which we work. We will have birds, cows that are pasturing around our farm. There will be dogs, several animals, right? Now, what happens? Sometimes we are concerned about the contamination that those animals can cause in our produce, but sometimes we forget that animals could also contaminate water. For instance, let's think about this example that I'm showing here on the slide. Let's imagine that we have cattle or cows over here, and they are up here, but suddenly it starts raining, and their waste will be going down to the river that we are using as a water source. Imagine that their waste contaminates my well or my river, or people who gives water to the animals so that they can drink water. Or, for instance, if we build a reservoir with plastic around it, but then we have different ducks or birds who drink water from there and they leave their little souvenirs around our reservoir. And then if it rains, it can flood the reservoir. So we need to think that there are different methods in which our water can get contaminated. So what happens, for instance, if we use water from a canal? And here there is a gentleman who kills pigs for their quinceañeras parties on Saturdays. And then here we have another gentleman who has sheep. And he lives over here, but then they pasture over there. So they will cross my canal and they will poop there, they will drink there. And then here, over here, maybe we have people who like to swim. And over here, we have houses that pour waste into the river. So there are a lot of opportunities for water contamination. Let's now review what the rule states about water contamination. If a farm is using water that is not covered by the definition of agricultural water, then this water will not be subject to the requirements of the rule. So my question for you right now will be, the agricultural that you use in your farm, is it in contact with your mangoes? If the answer is yes, then you have to see if it is post-harvesting water or pre-harvesting water. During this webinar, we will be focusing exclusively on the pre-harvesting part. However, I will be touching a little bit on the harvesting and post-harvesting activities as well. I mentioned already that the pre-harvesting water applications could be irrigation or foliar applications. And then Harvesting and post-harvesting water uses would be the water that we use during or after harvesting. This is water that I can use in my farm for hand washing so that the growers can wash their hands, as well as for cleaning and disinfection purposes, to clean my equipment, my systems, my containers, my baskets. There is a requirement, or rather a criterion for this water, which is the lack of generic E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample. So all the water that you use in harvesting and post-harvesting water needs to be lacking E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample. And it has to be using one of the FDA approved methods, 1603. Now, in the water that I'm using for harvesting and post-harvesting, again, we need to see a lack of E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample. And this is a very strict criterion. It's stricter actually than the pre-harvesting. And why? Because of the hazard that it implies. It's more risky. The fresh produce safety rule states the following for post-harvesting. I cannot use surface water that's not treated in any of the previous activities. I cannot use water from a canal if this water has not been previously treated for my employees to be able to wash their hands or to wash my equipment or my baskets. It's very important to take this into account for harvesting and post-harvesting water uses. And there is another requirement. For instance, if you're using wells and you're not treating your water from the wells for this type of activities, then you have to prove during the first year with 4 samples that you don't have generic E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample. And then every year you need to follow up with further analysis. And this is more than enough to comply with the agricultural water requirements for harvesting and post-harvesting activities. Now, for some of you who might have private certifications, you perform more than 4 analyses per year, right? So if you're already doing them, just keep doing them. Something that's also important to note. Well, you know what? I will talk about this later on once we talk about the exemptions. Is everybody following me? Everything's good? Everything's clear? Please, I need some signs on the chat. Great, thank you. I hope that everything is as clear as agricultural water in post-harvesting activities. Now, these are other uses that sometimes happen in farms. Okay, there's a question. Can you repeat the analysis requirements? Yes. If you use water that's not treated from a well to wash equipment, to wash baskets, to wash your hands, you need to prove during your first year that you have 4 samples with a lack of E. coli, and then after that, every year, 1 single analysis per year. However, if you have E. coli positive, then you have to do some corrections. Now, this is only for harvesting and post-harvesting uses. And I will now focus on what changed. Here you have the due date for compliance, which are in the past for all the sizes of all the businesses. Now, we're going to move on to talk about agricultural water uses during pre-harvesting. There is a very important aspect in the rule that says that any water that's used for agricultural purposes needs to be safe, and it needs to have sufficient sanitary quality for its intended use. Safe and with sanitary quality for the intended use. So you have to ask yourself if my water is in contact with my mango in my farm. For instance, here you can see that in these pictures, they are using a spraying system, and when they apply it, it's not in contact with the fruit, right? However, here it is in contact with the fruit, so that's considered agricultural water. Now, maybe in another orchard you're using agricultural water, and in another orchard you don't use agricultural water. What types of water sources do we use? We can use municipal supply or pipes. I've seen farms that use pipes to use city water. We also have groundwater, which is the well water, and we also have surface water, which is exposed water and it's exposed to contamination. These would be reservoirs, canals, rivers, creeks. It's very important to understand that if I'm using groundwater and I am pumping it to an open air reservoir, then I will be converting that water into surface water. We can also see that there's different types of irrigation, such as spraying, flooding, dripping, and depending on the farm, the water will be in contact or not with your produce. Now, the application timing is also risky. The later you start applying water to your crops, the risk will be lower because microorganisms will die naturally, right? Because they are exposed to the environment. And I will give you some details on this. Sergio never said that you can use contaminated water for your irrigation purposes because the microorganisms will die. No. But there are sometimes you can use water to irrigate your produce, and then weeks after that, you will be harvesting the produce. This produce will be less likely to be contaminated, right? However, in other farms, they irrigate in the morning and in the afternoon, they are already harvesting the produce. So the risk will be higher. I will be talking into more detail a little bit later about this. But in the case of the mango, we need to make sure that the water that we are applying to the produce happens way before harvesting. I will ask you a question. Please answer in the chat. If I irrigate now or if I harvest now, when did you irrigate? When was the last time the water was in contact with fruit? Please answer in the chat because this is very important for the assessment. 4 days. Great. Anybody else? 1 week. Very good. Someone is saying for safe water and adequate sanitary quality, would this be considered drinking water? No, Octavio. Drinking water has other characteristics. Now, every farm needs to determine, and now I will be addressing the question by Octavio, every farm needs to determine the sanitary quality of agricultural water in pre-harvesting activities through a water assessment. In English, it would be AGWA, Agricultural Water Assessment. You need to evaluate all of your water systems. The rule is no longer based on a microbiological analysis for the agricultural water use in pre-harvesting. In the past, when the rule was first passed, there were certain requirements where the farms need to have a profile of the water quality and they needed to calculate the geometrical median with a statistical number, with a certain number of samples, but this is no longer in place. Now you need to determine the sanitary quality of your water through an agricultural water assessment. And what are the expectations for this assessment? You need to establish your own standards and you need to understand why the criteria that you're using are adequate for your farm. Now, what does the rule say in very plain terms? In very, very plain terms, with a Mexican accent, if you will, it says that you need to perform an assessment of the hazards that are implied in your water systems. You need to check your water sources, your distribution of the water, your environmental conditions to see if there could be certain hazards that could contaminate water and my produce. And then you have to determine if you have to apply certain measures. I am the one who will be establishing my own standards, my own criteria, okay? And I need to be ready to explain my reasoning to the inspectors. There are two main approaches to comply with the modified rule: to perform the agricultural water assessment or to try to seek for an exemption. You can treat your water, you can use publicly supplied water, or if you're using non-treated groundwater, you need to comply with the post-harvesting agricultural water requirements. There are three ways of getting an exemption. Let me stop here for a little bit. You have three ways. First of all, you can treat your water. You can treat your agricultural water. Many farms will treat the water for their foliar applications. If you are using municipal water, which is publicly supplied from the city, you are using drinking water or you are using water from a pipe or from a tank, you need to ask for an analysis certificate where it says that it is drinking and safe water for compliance with the rule. Or if you're going to use non-treated groundwater and it will be in contact with your produce during pre-harvesting activities, you need to comply with the 4 analyses during the first year with a lack of E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample, and then on the following years, 1 analysis per year, and you will be able to obtain an exemption. You will not need to perform an agricultural water assessment in this case. You would be exempt from the assessment. Everybody's following me? Now, how do I perform an assessment? First of all, let me go back to something that was included in the 2015 rule. Back in 2015, the rule was requiring you to inspect and maintain your agricultural water systems, which are water supply, distribution system, pipes, hoses, holding tanks, tanks for applications. This would be considered your whole water system: the canal, the well, and the rule requires you to inspect and maintain your agricultural water systems within your farm. And you need to do that at the beginning of the season and at least once a year. You need to perform an inspection of the water systems that are under your control. And this will be an inspection and maintenance of pre-harvesting water as well as harvesting and post-harvesting water. Correct?
And it also says that you need to maintain all of your water systems to the extent that you can. This involves monitoring. You need to see whether or not there are any deficiencies and correct them. That you need to store the equipment in an appropriate way, and that you maintain your water system free of any animals or any waste product. So, what do you need to do? The first thing I need to do, according to the agricultural water section, is that I need to inspect and maintain all of my water systems. Now, you already do this to maintain your existing certifications. So, to simplify this, what does this mean? Well, I need to inspect my wells or my canal that I use as a source. I need to look at the reservoir if I haven't. I need to look at my water storage tanks, clean them appropriately to make sure that they don't accumulate any fungus. I need to ensure that my wellhead is properly covered and all of that. I also need to ensure all of this during harvest and post-harvest, and this was included in the 2015 rule. Now, the information that I can garner from this will be useful for me to be able to conduct my agricultural water assessment. So I already conducted the inspection and maintenance, everything that's within my control, both for the harvest as well as the post-harvest and pre-harvest. And this rule also requires that I conduct the agricultural water assessment. So what is it that I'm going to evaluate? I'm going to look at different factors, things that are on my farm and outside of my farm for the water that touches the mangoes or any food surface contacts during harvest. So I'm going to assess all the different factors that involve the water to identify any condition that could introduce any kind of risk into the water, any kind of risk contamination for the water, and that could subsequently contaminate my product or any food contact surfaces. And after assessing all of this, I would have to make determinations. So the first thing that I'm going to do for my assessment is, again, look at my water sources. I can get information from that inspection and conduct an assessment of my water sources, look at how they look, if there's any presence of animals. If I have a reservoir, look at that. I can check out the canal to assess the water, look at my neighbors. What happens if I'm right next to a farm that uses manure? And then all of a sudden, you get a big wind of some sort, and you'll see some of that manure creep into the water. Then all of a sudden, that water is going to come into my farm. So all of that dissolved manure is going to be making contact with my product. So you have to assess the various factors, both external as well as internal, that could introduce some kind of risk contaminant into the water. Now, how far am I from a stable, for example? Things as simple as, am I close to where they breed chickens? And I'll tell you a little bit about the chicken operations. You also need to look at environmental conditions. So I need to determine, once I conducted the assessment of my water systems, whether or not there's any known risk that could be introduced into the water. I have to determine whether or not to take measures to reduce this contamination risk. And what I will do is undertake corrective actions or mitigation actions or measures. And I'm going to do all of this at the beginning of the season, but at least once a year or any time we have any type of significant change on the farm operation. Can you see these cows here? These are photographs of real life. These cows are going to cross the channel at some point. You've got the horse right here, and then they're all going to leave a token of their appreciation there. And these are all things that you need to assess. Not on a farm in the middle of nowhere compared to a farm that's right next to where this gentleman takes his herd out for grazing. So it's a very different matter to assess a farm in the middle of nowhere compared to a farm that's neighboring a milk operation. So these are the things that the agency, though I don't speak on their behalf, FDA, but they want you to go out and determine all the potential contamination risks. And the assessment needs to be in writing, and you need to assess some of the following elements: the location of your water source. Some of this information you may have discovered during your inspection: the location and the nature of your water source, whether it's surface, groundwater, municipal water, the type of distribution system. My distribution system is open, like through the use of canals, or is it a closed system that uses hoses and pipes? what's the degree of protection of the source against potential contamination sources. Now, I may have a reservoir, but there is a gate there that doesn't allow for any animals to go in. Now, I'm not saying that you should have a reservoir. You still have to assess whether or not animals get in there or can get in there. You have to assess your well. If my well has a nice, very pretty cover, or whether my well doesn't have any cover at all, and there's a lot of vegetation surrounding the opening. There's a lot of mud around, a lot of mosquitoes, and sometimes it rains, and all of that goes back into the well. All of these things are things that I'm asked to assess and that require that I go and inspect personally, and I need to assess whether or not there's any potential risk there. For practices for the use of the agricultural water, methods of application of irrigation and foliar applications, the intervals between the water application and the harvest. This has a great deal of relevance for the existence of microorganisms, the characteristics of the crop. And we're talking about mangoes, but there are many things that we don't know. There's no science that will allow us to determine what happens if an organism adheres to the fruit, or how the UV light or environmental conditions affect that. So if I irrigate my product with contaminated water, how many days would that microorganism survive? For some products, we do have that information. In fact, for some products that have a different kind of surface like ours, such as Romanian lettuce, then when there's a contaminant, there's a greater probability that organisms can land and attach to that product. So there is information available for that. But in our industry, we still need to do a lot of research that relates specifically to that. We also need to look at the crop characteristics, which I mentioned earlier. Do mango characteristics allow for the development of microorganisms? How easy is it for them to attach to the surface if the water is contaminated? So there's a lot that we don't know. We're not sure what's going to happen to that mango later on. There may be some commercial wash that could reduce the load. Is there any risk of the microorganism getting into the fruit? We're talking also about environmental conditions, frequency of strong rainfall or extreme climate events. Any way the water gets to my product can be an influence on whether or not microorganisms get into the fruit or not. Now, I don't want you to get scared. Many of these things don't apply to us in particular. Why? Because my farm may be in the middle of nowhere, or because I only use agricultural water for my applications and I treat that water. And with that, I had an exemption. Nevertheless, I still have to monitor the treatment. What else was I going to say that's important? All right, getting back to the frequency of strong rainfall. What happens if you get a sudden rainfall and I'm right next to a location where there's a lot of manure, and we know that that manure is going to contaminate my water source? So what happens to my canals? Where's that water coming from? I can give you an example of something that we did in Peru. If I take water from a reservoir, for example, if that reservoir is full, or if it's almost dry or empty, when it's almost dry or empty and underneath there's some mud, and you extract water from that, then you start moving everything that's underneath. And in that sediment, you'll have microorganisms that you could carry forward, or there may be some other microorganisms that you're dragging along. That's different to just grabbing water from the surface. So there are many observations that you need to take into account to determine whether or not your water is safe and it has the necessary sanitary quality for the purpose intended. So there are 4 elements that you need to assess: the assessment of the distribution system, the location and nature of the water source, the type of system, the uses, the characteristics of your crop, and the environmental conditions. And the last factor or element would be any other relevant factors. What else is around the canals or the water sources? And among these, you would include into the analysis that the farm water evaluation does not require microbiological analysis. In some cases, you will have to do a microbiological analysis of your water. But this isn't the only contaminant that you would look at, and I'm speaking about generic E. coli. Some of these are useful, but they're not the main foundation to make all of your decision. The analyses that you're going to undertake are part of your overall assessment. You can use what you already have in place and supplement that with additional analysis for your assessment. Now, if I have some risk-based results that will allow me to make decisions, let's use this flow chart. What happens if the agricultural water is not safe or doesn't have the necessary or adequate sanitary quality for the intended use? Well, we could have yes or no here. If it's yes, then you discontinue its use. Let me give you an example that I saw in Arizona a few years ago. We had a few sheep get out of a stable, and the first one got out of the stable and was followed by another one and followed by yet another one. So they all went into the canal, and the sheep, some of the sheep fell into the irrigation channels. They found one dead animal and they discontinued the use of that water. Now, in that case, or what happens if some manure lands in the water that I intend to use for my irrigation or some foliar applications, then if I see that, then I'm going to discontinue the use and come up with a corrective measure such as treatment, or I'll let the water run until it gets rid of all of that. But these are all common sense type of measures. Now, what happens if you have neighboring lands? Is there any potential risk that you may be able to foresee? If it's something that stems from the presence of any animals, or if it involves any human waste or what have you, then the first thing to do, if that's the case, is to implement mitigation measures as quickly as possible. Now, if you have other conditions that offer the possibility of introducing hazardous waste or contaminants into the water, or can contaminate the fruit or food product services, then I need to implement the mitigation measures right away, and perhaps not do it the following year. Now, if I didn't find anything, then I didn't find anything. I'll continue with the usual inspections as outlined by the 2015 rule, as well as the annual analysis, and I will continue with this regimen to maintain my agricultural water use systems. So we have some examples here of corrective measures and mitigation measures. I have 6 minutes left. I do want to show you some photographs. So we have some corrective measures here that I mentioned when I was describing the diagram, and these are immediate measures. Now, mitigation measures allow for more flexibility. The rule was designed for all products, but there are things that would not apply in this case to mangoes. So myself, in my farm, will determine what mitigation measures I can implement. Now, I have to do a reassessment each year for my mango farms to see whether or not anything changed, or at any time where I observe any significant change. For example, what happens if I use channel water and I switch over to well water, or vice versa? Let's say my agricultural use water for the pre-harvest changes, so I have to conduct an assessment. So what happens if I suddenly have a neighbor that brought a lot of animals that are going to be drinking from the channel that I'm using for irrigation? Well, I need to conduct a reevaluation. These are two examples, right? So I've already talked about the exemptions. The farms will be exempt of conducting the assessment if you meet certain criteria that pertains to farm water or agricultural water during the harvest and post-harvest. And again, we have to do 4 analysis of generic E. coli in samples of 100 milliliters. If you observe any presence, you have to start again. Now, there's something very important. This criteria does not apply for this exemption if your water is surface water. If your agricultural water is surface water, it could be from a reservoir, from a stream, or from a channel. It's not based on those 4 assessments or analysis that are absence of any E. coli. If you don't have that, you cannot qualify for the exemption. Now, if you get water from the city, then you have to prepare all the documentations, or you can come up with the necessary protocol to ensure that it's FSMA applicable. Now, if I apply some treatment that is valid, then you won't have to do the evaluation or assessment for agricultural water. So you don't have to treat the water in all circumstances. Each farm needs to determine what they're going to do. Another thing that's important for the exemption is that you need to ensure that the water quality doesn't change during the use. And we have here all the records. Any findings derived from the inspection of the agricultural water systems, you have to have all your assessments in written form. If you do your analyses, you need to produce the results, the method employed, any backup or support information regarding the frequency of the sampling or any other criteria. If you don't use the E. coli generica sampling, then you should describe the methodology used. You also need to have the results report. If you have any corrective measures that you implemented or any mitigation measures as a result of the assessment for agricultural water, then you have to show the documentation of all the measures taken and the information related to the results of these measures. The compliance deadlines are April 7th, 2025 for large companies, so a month away or 3 weeks from now. Small companies that have yearly sales of 250,000 to 500,000, April 7th, and for very small companies, 25,000 to 250,000, same deadline. Now, there's no need for concern here. The idea here isn't so much to collect information, but really to come up with the proper determinations. I think that is the biggest challenge that we have here. And let me show you some photographs. In Mexico, we call this just shooting around. You know, we're trying to make a water assessment here. We visited a reservoir in Peru somewhere, and I went and took a look at the reservoir. Now, in the meantime, you can go ahead and write in your questions in the chat room, and I can describe a little bit about what I saw. That's a lot of water, right? So that's the San Lorenzo Reservoir. That's where they get their water, and it comes out on this side. And this shows you everything that we saw out there near Tambo Grande, La Cruceta, Piedra Roja. So you go and look at all of these channels there, right? So we went to look at the original source of the water, and not just that. I thought, well, let's go see where the water comes out, and we went to where it originates. Let me just go ahead and open all of them. So we went to the source where it originates. This is a picture of another channel in a different farm. So we went to the place where it originates, and here the reservoir was almost empty, and the water had a smell to it, and it was very dark. But as it moved further along, you could see it was clearer. Something was happening that it appeared to clear it up and clean it up. And then we could see it go through some towns. And you can see here, this looks really nice, but then you can see that there's some homes here. So there's a high risk of solid refuge there and other discharges. We also had restaurants right next to the water there that used the water for their purposes. We saw people swimming, washing their clothes, and that's not necessarily bad, but it's basically the reality that exists in all of our countries, right? But the idea is to go look at what's going on. But look at how pretty the water looks there. It makes you want to jump in and go swimming compared to this really dark black water over here. But it traveled and traveled until it got to the farms. And here it looks different. But something that I was told in these farms is that those farmers did not use the water. They used gravity irrigation, but then the water that they used for spraying the water was water that was treated. And so even though that water was surface water and it arrived at its destination crystal clear, it's harder to treat that way. But what they told me was that they would treat it and they would use it like this after the treatment was applied. So they would use it for foliar applications. And we looked at all of these things, and these farmers could, in fact, qualify for an exemption. But look at all of the challenges that they face here. Homes that are right next to the irrigation channels, towns right next to those channels. In this case, the reservoir was pretty low. So the intake to the reservoir is over here on the other side, and we also looked at that. But at the end of the day, we determined that they could, in fact, be eligible for an exemption. So each farm is different with different challenges. But what was it that we did? We went and looked at everything. We went out and looked at everything. And it was interesting because we were driving on the road, and all of a sudden, two people plopped out of the water because they were swimming in one of the channels. It was very fun and really a fun trip. Any questions? We have a question in the chat that says, those 4 tests are conducted over what time period? What was that? The E. coli test, those 4 tests, how much time do you have to do them? It's over the course of a year. You have to do 4 or more analysis for generic E. coli, and it needs to be as similar to the water use application as possible. There's a comment also that on FSMA assessment on the farm, the auditor mentioned that the drip irrigation water also had a risk of contact with the fruit. Remember what my favorite word in all of this related to food safety was? Risk. Risk. And remember what the 2015 rule said, which we still have to do, inspection and maintenance. So what do? You walk throughout your farm, you look at all of that. Anything can happen on a farm, but what is the statistical probability that I might have a little drip irrigation hose break and then all of a sudden starts shedding water all over the place? What's the likelihood of that happening? So, Octavio, I think that this is something that I would be mindful of, but I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. So we need to be attentive and mindful of this and train all of my farm personnel. Remember what I said. You need to be prepared. That's a mitigation measure. When we looked at the inspection of my water systems, I need to see whether or not my system is working properly. And generally speaking, all of our systems work pretty well. And yes, it's possible that a little hose might tear or break. And the idea is to just fix it and you're done. That's all there is to it. And that's when people need to, or start saying, well, you need to have everything calibrated. My suggestion is to think and question the risk of all your practices. I questioned a lot of things where you mentioned, why did it break? Was it too high a pressure? How much product was affected? I mean, if I have a 100-hectare farm and it's a little hose that broke underneath a tree, you might not even have affected all the fruit on that tree. So that's water from a channel or from a well. And what do? You do what I mentioned in the presentation. We have another question from Miguel Encinas. Can you tell me the full name of the rule? It's the food safety rule for fresh produce. If you give me a second, I can share a copy of the rule in the chat room. Just give me a few seconds here. Let me see if I can find it. Additionally, the National Mango Board has manuals on this rule. So I just shared a Dropbox link where you can all read the courtesy translation of the section that pertains to subsection E related to agricultural water. And before we conclude, Doctor, is this rule already in effect, or is there time still for farmers to do the necessary work to be able to be in full compliance? Well, they have to get ready, but there's no need for concern. These are the deadline dates for all the types of companies listed. There's no reason for alarm. We just need to get to work. It took me about 2 hours. In between, we ate an excellent ceviche. We had some really nice drinks at one of the farms. The idea is just to walk the property, walk the entire field, and look for everything, look at everything. I think that the soles on your shoes will be the best tool for you to conduct a proper assessment. You just need to walk the property, look at the entirety of the farm, and think about any potential risks. Very good, Dr. Sergio. Thank you very much. We hope to have you with us at the next webinar, which is scheduled for April 24th of this year from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this will relate to low temperature mango farm management. Thank you very much, Doctor.